So the recording we will see is from Professor Sergio Rossi in Fribourg, Switzerland. He talked to us last year also. He was on the yes side with the Swiss referendum in 2017, 2018. Was one of the few influential economists in Switzerland to go to the yes side. For those who don't know, the Swiss also had a citizens initiative to change the money system. They needed a certain amount of signatures, which they collected, and then it had to be voted upon by a referendum. Some people think we got totally creamed, 75% against 25%, with 25% in favor. Others would see it as well. That was quite a accomplishment to get 25% on a measure where the banks and the commercial banks at a certain moment were just scaring people away from the proposal, and actually were outright deceiving people about the proposal. I found Sergio Rossi because he was the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Central Banking. And that's one of the nicest, driest pieces of literature you can read, but it's very informative. It has entries by people like Steve Keen and quite some by Richard Werner. And actually the very first entry is on 100% banking. And the Chicago Plan has its own entry, and all kinds of other things that we are interested in have their own entry in that book. Sergio Rossi is also working with a Canadian economist, Rochon, and they're very in the what we call the post-Keynesian thinking or school in economics. And their idea of how banks work is very much of what we think is the credit creation theory. But their terminology is a little different. They talk about endogenous money versus exogenous money. And endogenous money theory is that the money somehow comes from outside of the, or is generated from within the system itself. And in this case, from banks, from commercial banks. And they, in their own way, have found proof, evidence for that. And they already have been saying this for maybe 30 years, but specifically for 20 years already. So that part of post-Keynesian school is very much on our side, at least on the side of the diagnosis of what is happening. They might not all be on our side of doing monetary reform. At least they have the theory right, which is, of course, you know, for us, we're doing a 1-2 step. First the diagnosis, and then the right therapy. So that's Sergio Rossi. Are we ready, Stephen?
Yes, we are. And I would only add, Sergio Rossi comes very close to MMT, but he also looks in a very, as best he can, honestly, at our way of doing it. And he's thoughtful of seniorage, and that'll come out towards the end of this recording, and it might be something we want to look at too, or perk your attention for. So anyhow, I'm going to share the screen and get that going, and we'll be set in a moment. I have to find, oh, here we go.
Consumers' behavior and the public finance as well. So I think also, as Howard said, that the endogenous money perspective is promising, even though so far, and to the best of my knowledge, the post-Keynesian economic school has not really developed such an approach on a normative ground. Post-Keynesians are clear, very clear, crystal clear about the fact that money comes from banks providing credit lines to firms or also to consumers. But post-Keynesians still have to go a step further from a positive into a normative perspective, saying what should be done within the banking sector or at the banking system level to avoid that there are further financial crises having not a behavioral origin only, but also a structural origin. And this is what I'm going to talk about in my talk. I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation, if you agree. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see that. It's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, so my talk is about, the title I gave is National Currencies and Global Imbalances, because you know global imbalances apparently, as Mankiw has explained, or also as other so-called heterodox economists have explained, global imbalances apparently are the result of agents' behavior. It is said that China is the major exporter in the world and that countries like the United States are net importers. So there is a kind of global imbalance between, say, China and the US. One is a net exporting country, other one is a net importing country, and this might give rise to some major issues. In my talk, I would like to point out that beyond behavioral reasons, what matters, and even more than behavioral reasons, are the structural, monetary, the physiology. If we have a kind of physician approach, the physiology means that we have first to understand how the human body works in order to be able to detect if there is some medical issues. So first, we have to understand how the economic system works, and this is all about money and payments. Money and payments are instrumental in order for the economic activity to be, in a sense, contributing to the well-being of people, and money and payments relate to banks. So this is the triad we are going to explore in the first section, in order then to understand what is wrong, the pathology. What is wrong, again, not on the behavioral level, but at the monetary structural level. The global financial crisis, which is a systemic crisis that burst in the United States in 2006 and then became a worldwide crisis in 2008 after Lehman Brothers was failed for bankruptcy. Well, this crisis is not just like linked to behavior or misbehavior by banksters, but it actually has a deeper origin in the structural disorder of the monetary system. And so once we have understood this issue, we are able to provide a posology, like a medical doctor, to have a reform, a structural monetary reform, in order for further crises not to be systemic. I'm not going to be able to avoid any financial crisis, but what I'm going to do is to try to set up a banking system working properly, compatible with the nature of money, in order to avoid that the system per se is out of order. And this then will allow us to conclude, to fix two major points at the national and then at the international level. Those two plans are really, in a sense, very, very crucial. As I said, the global financial crisis apparently is over, but we are still paying the cost for it. A number of countries, a number of people in countries do still suffer from the negative impacts of this global financial crisis, even though apparently banks have been fixing the issues, and also there has been a new kind of regulation, Basel III agreements, and you name it, in order to try to constrain bankers' misbehavior. But again, there are still two major flaws, structural flaws in the workings of our payment system, which are based on the banking sector. Within countries, what is the domestic level, the endogenous money perspective explains that loans make deposits. This is the famous expression that Schumpeter used in a volume published after he died in 1954. Loans make deposits because banks don't need to have pre-existing deposits, you know, in order to lend any amount they think profitable for them. It's not deposit making loans, it is the opposite, loans making deposits. But this causality is not enough to avoid that there are some imbalances at the macroeconomic level between what we call the money supply, which is in fact the total amount of bank deposits within a given banking system, and on the other hand, the total volume of produced output. You know that Milton Friedman is famously remembered for his famous sentence, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, namely a monetary policy phenomenon. He meant because too much money chases too few goods. So this money to output relationship is crucial, and we have to investigate not just the behavioral reasons, but the structural reasons beyond a kind of disequilibrium between these two magnitudes, the money supply on the one hand and total produced output on the other hand. Then at the international level, which is actually the economic system that exists between countries, well, at the international level, national currencies, not just the US dollar, but also the euro, the British pound, the Swiss franc, and so forth. There are some so-called strong or key currencies that are considered as if they were objects of trade. So money, we will see it, it is a means of payment within countries, and it becomes an object of trade between countries across the foreign exchange markets. And this we will see is also a factor explaining global imbalances, namely a net importing country thinks that it is in a position to pay finally its net imports by just disposing of a number of money units, which is actually a pure numerical entry in the bank's balance sheet. This is also a problem we will discover later on. So to conclude this introduction, as already pointed out, money, banks, and payments are at stake for the orderly or the disorderly working of our economic system as a whole. And we will therefore have to investigate first, how is it possible for money to exist? So the first question, the crucial question is, what is money? What is money is a question that has not yet been answered correctly, unanimously. Schumpeter, as I quoted him earlier on, wrote in his seminal book that views on money are as difficult to describe as are shifting clouds. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to say the form of a cloud if it is shifting over time. And then Peter Bofinger, a German economist who was in the Council of Economic Advisors of the German government until recently, he published a monetary policy volume in German and then translated into English in 2001, where he initially on page 3 pointed out that the definition of money can still be regarded as an almost unresolved issue. We are still struggling within the academics profession about the nature of money. What is money? You know this expression that John Hicks coined, money is what money does. We don't know what money is, and so we consider it looking at the functions that money is supposed to play. So money is a unit of account, is a means of payment, and a store of value. But here, let me quote a Swiss economist. He was a professor in the US at university level, Peter Nihans, a monetarist, a friend of Milton Friedman. And Peter Nihans published a book in 1978, where he correctly pointed out that what we need is a theory that treats money as it really is, namely a medium of exchange. But this expression, medium of exchange, has to be explored and explained correctly. And Nihans noted that the real problem is not one of classifying the functions that money plays, but we need a better analytical understanding of the functions that money plays. What does it mean, money to be a medium of exchange? The word medium, in fact, is not correct here because a medium is something physical. So neoclassical economics, or the mainstream economics nowadays, considers that money is the equivalent, the general equivalent of all other non-monetary goods that are exchanged against it. I'm delivering a number of money units. In exchange, I'm receiving something, a car, a service, or whatsoever. So money would move in the opposite direction as other non-monetary goods. But if so, then money has to be explained as if it were gold. But gold actually has been abandoned. Money has been, gold has been demonetized. Money is purely numerical. And Schumpeter said nobody would exchange a number against an umbrella. And I would add, especially when it rains. So we have to go deeper than this superficial understanding of man through its functions it is supposed to play. And the essential function that money plays is to be a means of payment. So consider that money is not an object of payment, but a means of payment. It is the means through which payments are carried out within any country. And here, let me quote John Hicks in a book he published in 1967, Critical Essays of Monetary Theory. He pointed out correctly that every transaction, and I would say every payment, involves three parties: the payer, which is a buyer, the seller, who is the payee, and the banker as a go-between. So Hicks here points out that the banker through which the payment order goes is neither buying nor selling anything. He or she just provides the means of payment, the number of monetary units that the payer needs to pay finally his or her debt against the payee, the seller of any good or service. And to explore further and to expound on this, Augusto Graziani, the father of the Italian monetary circuit school, who died some 10 years ago now, points out correctly that money comes into existence only at the moment a payment is made. Before the payment is no money. And once the payment has been carried out, money disappears to give rise to a bank deposit. A bank deposit that the agent receiving a payment obtains in his or her bank account. So money does exist only within payments, which are instantaneous transactions. At that moment, at that instant of time, in one and the same act, money is created. The borrower becomes a debtor of the bank, which has been granting to it or her or him a line of credit. And the agent receiving a payment becomes a creditor of the bank, into which there is a bank deposit that is newly generated. So let me illustrate this with a graph. We have three agents: the bank through which the payment order goes, the payer, and the payee. Here I use the Swiss franc as an example. CHF is the acronym for Swiss franc because I'm currently in Switzerland. So the payer asks the bank to obtain a number of X Swiss francs. If the bank accepts to provide a credit line to the payer receives this amount of Swiss francs. So he or she is credited with this amount of X Swiss francs, but it is simultaneously debited in order for this agent to pay finally the counterpart, say a firm selling some goods to the payer. But the payee here, the firm, is not paid finally until the firm is debited by the same amount. So you see, banks do create money, but this creation is also simultaneously a destruction of money because nobody, not even the most influent bankers, can create something positive out of nothing. As my first PhD supervisor, Bernard Schmidt, said, the banking system splits the number 0 into a positive and simultaneously negative number of money units. Here, the bank through which the payment order goes has been splitting the number 0 into plus X Swiss francs minus X Swiss francs. If you take the sum of those two amounts, it is 0. But splitting the number 0 into plus X and minus X money units allows the payer to finally pay the transaction and the payee to be finally paid. So this is an instantaneous circular flow coming from to and going back to the same bank through which the payment order goes. But the result of such a payment, this is not a flow, but a stock magnitude. Remember, in classical economists, they do believe that money comes from somewhere and goes somewhere else. So money would be either a stock or at rest or moving around on the wing. In fact, money is a flow, not a stock moving around. And the result of this instantaneous flow is a bank deposit, which is a stock magnitude, a stock of purchasing power, which exists over time. So let's look at the result of the payment that I illustrated earlier on with this circular flow. The result is that the payer obtained a loan from the bank, X Swiss francs, and the payee has a deposit of X Swiss franc. For simplicity reasons, let's suppose it is the same bank through which both the payer and the payee pay themselves or are paid. Suppose there is only one bank in the country where this payment occurs, for simplicity reasons. You see, as a result of the payment, what we call the money supply, M, has increased by X Swiss francs. You see, therefore, that this mechanism that loans make deposits has been increasing what we call the money supply, or M0, the relevant monetary aggregate, or M1, it doesn't matter. And this number of money units in the form of a bank deposit exists until the payer repays the debt to the bank through which he or she has been obtaining a loan. So far, there is actually a constant circulation of debts and credits through the medium of the banker, who brings them together and clears them as the debts fall due. This is the whole science of banking as it was 3,000 years before Christ and as it is today, Michelin's 1913. So the job of the banks is to issue money in order for payments to occur and to be final between the two parties involved, the seller and the buyer of anything. But actually, we live in a monetary structural disorder within countries, but also between countries. Within countries, so within the domestic economy, this mechanism, this causality between bank loans and bank deposits is fine as far as those payments occur on the factor market, which is namely the labor market. If a firm borrows from a bank to pay out wages, the firm is indebted, and then wage earners have a credit, namely a bank deposit. But in this case, as we see here, the payer has a debt to which there is a new output that corresponds. Because if we increase the money supply, delta M is plus X, we also increase simultaneously the produced output, delta Q. So banks are instrumental in order for firms to pay the wage bill. And once the payment of wages occurs, the newly created bank deposits have a positive purchasing power because they are associated with produced output. If wage earners do spend this deposit to buy what the firm has been producing, it means that, well, they might obtain something real. It's not just a pure number, it is a number representing produced output. So there is a money to output relationship that this causality doesn't affect. The money supply has been increasing, but also produced output has been increasing simultaneously by the same amount. So there is no inflationary gap, no inflationary pressure. But the same causality, loans making deposits, the same causality might originate what we call extra or empty money across the financial markets when firms are borrowing not to pay out wages, but to speculate across financial markets. And in these firms, we might also include financial institutions, because it is clear that in this case, banks do increase the volume of lending. Therefore, the volume of deposits resulting from this lending increases, but there is no new produced output. So delta M is higher than delta Q. Well, this has been observed since the 1980s in the Western countries, but until recently, banks, central bankers in particular, have not intervened because they didn't observe an increase in what we call CPI inflation. Namely, the consumer goods market has not shown this inflationary pressure because this empty money or this extra money has been spent not on the goods market, but across the real or financial markets, namely for buying real estate objects or for buying financial assets. You remember Bernanke saying, well, we don't look at what occurs across the financial markets because our job is to make sure the price level remains stable on the goods market. And if so, then our job, our mission, our central bank mandate is achieved. No, this is not correct, because what occurs on financial markets, what occurs on real estate markets is also important for financial stability issues and for the macroeconomic situation of the whole country. So let me illustrate rapidly what might occur if two banks do abuse of their credit capacity and provide each other a credit line to buy across the interbank market some financial assets. Bank A in country A, Bank B in the same country might enter into bilateral credit lines. So Bank A might provide a loan to Bank B in order for Bank B to buy some assets from Bank A, and Bank B might also provide a loan to Bank A in order for Bank A to buy financial assets from Bank B. So any bank might open any amount of credit lines it will for any kinds of transactions. Here, those transactions are what Richard Werner calls non-GDP based transactions. So transactions that are financed via bilateral credit lines that banks do open each other for speculative activities, as a result of which we notice that there is an increase in the total volume of bank deposits, X plus Y monetary units, say Swiss francs or US dollars or whatsoever, but in fact there is no increase in produced output. This introduces an inflationary gap between money and output. The money to output relationship is affected because the money supply has been increasing by X plus Y monetary units, but total output produced has not increased. So there is an inflationary pressure spent on financial markets or on the real estate market. Now, beyond this structural disorder at the country level, there is also an international monetary disorder, which doesn't pertain just to agents' behavior, it pertains to the disorderly working of the international monetary regime. I wrote here international with a hyphen to point out that this international economy is the economic space that exists between countries. Within countries, we have a production economy, a monetary economy of production, as Keynes used to say. Within countries, goods are produced that we might use, like computer, mobile phones, and whatsoever. We might use goods that have been produced in different countries. For instance, I'm using a computer that has been designed in the United States, but some of its components have been produced in China and Vietnam, and then put together perhaps in Brazil. So we might have a multinational production, but all this production occurs within the domestic economies involved. And between these countries, we have just an exchange economy. The international economy is an economy of exchange because production occurs within countries and not beyond them. But at this international level, in this international economic space, it is impossible, it is logically impossible for any given national currency to be a means of final payment. Let's be clear about the definition of final payment. Here I'm quoting Charles Goodhart, famous book. Charles Goodhart was a professor of economics at the London School of Economics when I was doing my PhD there, but he was also serving in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. And now he retired, but he is a mainstream economist, but still open-minded. And he correctly pointed out that a final payment obtains when a seller of a good or a service or another asset receives something of value from the purchaser, which leaves the seller with no further claim on the buyer. So it means that a final payment occurs if I'm delivering some money units to the seller of something, and he or she has no further claim against me, and I have no further debt against it. Now, if we transfer this definition at the international level, we can easily understand that it is really impossible for any national currency, even the so-called strong or key currencies, say the US dollar, the Swiss franc nowadays, it is logically impossible for any national currency to be a final means of payment. It is just a promise of payment, in fact, because the payer country, the payee country, is left with a claim on the payer's country. Let me illustrate this with an example where two countries are involved. Country A, suppose the United States of America, and then country C, suppose China. I already pointed out that China is a net exporting country, the US is a net importing country. So let's suppose that the US is importing something from China. A US firm imports something from a Chinese firm. The payment goes from the local importer in the US, which obtains a loan from the US banking system in order for the firm, say the importing firm, to pay finally for its net imports or for its purchases abroad. The result of this loan is that there is a new deposit created within the US banking system, but the deposit owner is a non-resident in the US. It is namely the banking system of the exporting country. And this banking system of China, in my case, records the image of those US dollar deposits in the official reserves of China. And as a result, the banking system of China, in this case, credits the payee, say a Chinese firm, of the relevant amount in local currency, namely the renminbi or the Chinese yuan. You see here, there is a kind of duplication of this deposit. There is a deposit in the US banking system, which cannot leave this system, logically speaking, but there is a second deposit in the net exporting country. And this is what Jacques Rueff called a process of duplication. So we live actually in a non-system for international payments. This expression, non-system for international payments, has been coined by a US economist, John Williamson, in the 1970s. And this explains that what Jacques Rueff called deficit without tears might exist. The US is a net importing country, but in the US, nobody cries if the US records a trade deficit. On the contrary, you might live as US citizens with a high living standard, apparently, because you might import without making any sacrifice to export something equivalent. But even more than deficit without tears, the expression that I'm willing to use is Fritz Machlup expression, payment deficits. Because in fact, against what German people believe, there is no misbehavior if a country is a net importing country. Germany is a net exporting country and wants that everybody else in the euro area has also the same attitude. Germany wants that also Spain, Greece, Italy become net exporting countries, but it is logically impossible for all countries in the world to be a net exporting one. If Germany is a net exporting country, we need some net importing countries, say Spain, Greece, or the United States. So it's not bad per se to have a trade deficit, as it is not good per se to have a trade surplus. What is bad is to have a payment deficit, because a payment deficit means that the country doesn't really pay what it should do. So if the US is a net importing country, this is not bad per se. What is bad is that the US doesn't really pay finally for the net imports. And this is the origin of a major disorder, because national currencies are used as if they were objects of trade, but in fact they are means of payment. Remember, Schumpeter claimed nobody would exchange a number against an umbrella. The US dollar is purely a number, as it is the Swiss franc, the euro, the British pound, the Chinese yuan, and you name it. So no national currency can be a means of final payment between countries considered as a whole. And the fact that national currencies are denatured at the international level, using them as objects of trade, means that this is a source of what also Jacques Rueff called the exorbitant privilege. Countries having a key currency might have this exorbitant privilege to buy without paying, to import without exporting. And this creates global imbalances. Indeed, Jacques Rueff and Fred Hirsch published a small pamphlet in 1965 where they explained this very clearly. If I had an agreement with my tailor that whatever money I pay him returns to me the very same day as a loan, I would have no objection at all to ordering more suits from him. Transfer this example to China and US foreign trade. If the Chinese economy exports more than it imports to the US and from the US, it means that it is actually lending to the United States the amount of Chinese income the United States needs to pay finally their net imports. And this goes along and continues as long as the Chinese government is willing to buy US government bonds. But this actually is not an orderly working international monetary system. In fact, the huge liquidity that is denominated in US dollars that exists as a result of the enormous US current account deficit cannot but be recycled in the local financial sector, namely in the US financial system, providing therefore the means for the creation and the bursting of bubbles that might ravage the local economy. This is a quote from one of my papers published in 2009. What I was pointing out at this time was that the subprime bubble, the subprime crisis, and the US financial crisis that resulted therefore is the result of this international monetary disorder. Because if the US trade deficits are not paid finally, the amount of US dollars increases in the US banking system. And as these are deposits that the US banks have to remunerate with an interest payment, then US banks will try to recover on the asset side of their balance sheets the interest income they need to pay interest on the bank deposits, even those of non-residents in the United States. So this subprime bubble was in fact inflated by this international monetary disorder, which has to be fixed. And this quote from the governor of the Central Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, in 2009, before a G20 meeting, Xiao Xuan pointed out that we have to reform the international monetary system and to create an international reserve currency that is disconnected from individual nations, the emphasis is mine, and is able to remain stable over the long run, thereby removing the inherent deficiencies caused by using credit-based national currencies. It is not enough to say that loans make deposits and that's it. We have to understand that at the international level, this causality might give rise to financial disorders at the structural level, which have to be eradicated not with a behavioral reform like Basel III agreements, like too big to fail regulations, but with a structural reform proposal. And this is what I intend to do in the last minutes of my talk, to present structural monetary reforms at international and then at national level. What are the principles that we have to follow in order to have an international monetary order, to have a new international monetary regime working proper? Well, we need to make sure that all payments are final, not just for the residents or non-residents involved, those agents in the private or the public sector. We need that payments are final also for countries, each defined as a whole. And a country should be represented at the international level by its own central bank. NCB is the acronym for the National Central Bank. So the United States of America should be represented at the international monetary level by the US Federal Reserve. The Euro area should be represented at the international level by the European Central Bank, and so forth. And these international transactions should be carried out between the national central banks involved, but referring to an international settlement institution. If we look at the monetary system within countries, we notice that there are two layers. we have a two-tier banking system. On top of banks, we have the national central bank. And we bank through commercial banks. We are non-bank agents, firms, individuals, or even the public sector banks through commercial banks. But banks have to pay themselves via the central bank, logically speaking, because nobody can issue one's own acknowledgement of debt and make it acceptable as if it were a means of payment. Here I disagree with Minsky when he said, and he wrote, that everybody can issue money, the problem is to get it accepted. No, this is wrong. I disagree with Minsky because we need, as Hicks pointed out, a go-between the payer and the payee. If we conflate, if we confuse the payer and the issuer of the money units, we are in a problem. We have a problem because I cannot pay by issuing my own acknowledgement of debt. We need a central bank, if we have banks together, to pay the bank traffic, the bank payment traffic across the interbank market. And at the international level, logically speaking, we need such a third tier, an international settlement institution, what Keynes called an international clearing bank, or what we have now in Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements. We have the name, but the BIS in Basel is not yet an international settlement institution. It is just a forum where central bankers gather to discuss about monetary policy issues and to try to collaborate along those issues. So these international settlement institutions should issue a truly supranational currency, what Keynes called the bank bond. This supranational currency is not to be confused with the single currency we have in the euro area. We need a common, not a single currency. We don't need a single world currency. We notice that a single European currency is problematic, actually. We don't need to abandon our monetary sovereignty at national level, but we need to have an international settlement institution issuing its own means of final payment for the national central bank community. And if so, then this supranational currency should just be the vehicle through which a purchasing power is transferred from the buyer to the seller, not at the individual level, but at the country level. So if the US is a net importing country, well, we need, say, an international monetary fund issuing not special drawing rights, but any kind of supranational money unit. And this should be the vehicle through which the United States transfers, say, to China, a purchasing power, if not in the form of goods, in the form of financial assets. And this avoids the duplication we have referred to in my talk earlier on, and therefore this could avoid global imbalances. Then within countries, let me conclude rapidly, what are the principles for a domestic monetary reform? Here I got inspiration from Ricardo's 1824 reform proposal, which 20 years later became the Bank Act, reforming the Bank of England. We, as Ricardo suggested, we have to separate the bank's layers or ledgers into two departments. The Bank Act in 1844 was just a reform at the central bank level. I suggest a reform for all banks, commercial banks, investment banks, and you name it. All banks' bookkeeping should be divided into two separate and distinct departments at the functional level. The first department should record all issuance of money. Since money is issued when banks provide credit lines, we have to split money from credit in the bank's records. If banks do provide money, if they issue money, this should be entered into the first department, what I call the issue department. Whereas if banks do provide credit lines, this should enter into a second department, what I call the banking department. Why this splitting of two departments in the bank's ledgers? It is because only in this way we can avoid that banks abuse of their credit capacity and provide loans for non-GDP based transactions that are actually given from scratch. I was in favor of the banking reform in Switzerland that the people rejected in 2016, the so-called Folger reform, suggested to get rid of this possibility for banks to provide credit lines even if they don't dispose of pre-existing deposits. Well, this is too radical in my view. Banks should still provide credit lines ex nihilo starting from scratch, but only for GDP-based transactions, only for those transactions that increase produced output, namely for the payment of wages. But banks should be forbidden, should stop providing loans starting from scratch if those loans are just for non-GDP based transactions, namely for financial transactions that don't increase produced output. And in this case, if banks are still willing to provide loans for non-GDP based transactions, they might still do so, but only as far as they have enough pre-existing deposits. This is why these two departments are in a position to avoid that banks abuse of their credit capacity and inflate financial or credit bubbles that eventually burst. And here, let me quote from David Ricardo's original work. He said that the central bank, the Bank of England, performs two operations of banking, which are quite distinct and have no necessary connection with each other. The central bank issues a paper currency, or what today we call settlement balances, purely scriptural central bank money. And secondly, it advances money in the way of loans to merchants and others. These two operations of banking have no necessary connection, and this will appear obvious from this. They might be carried on by two separate bodies without the slightest loss of advantage, either to the country or to the merchants who receive accommodation from such loans. So my proposal of reform, splitting the bank's books into two departments, well, doesn't affect any of those transactions, but actually avoids that banks abuse of their credit capacity to inflate financial bubbles, credit bubbles that generate systemic crises. So let's conclude. Let me conclude in a few minutes because I'm running out of time. We need structural reforms in banking to avoid further systemic crises. The key words here are structural and systemic. We will always have financial crises, but we must avoid that those crises become systemic, because a systemic crisis means that the system is out of order. And actually our banking system is out of order within countries and between countries. But to fix those issues, we need a structural monetary reform, not just new banking regulations trying to impact bankers' behavior. The first systemic structural reform is at the international level. We need an international settlement institution through which national central banks can pay and can be paid finally, to make sure that no payment deficits occur at the international level, and this would reduce global imbalances. Then within countries, we need to make sure that the bank's business is framed within an issue department and a banking department to avoid that banks provide excessive money or empty money that actually provides then an inflationary gap, which has to be captured correctly, not just looking at the consumer price index, but also looking at asset price inflation. So you see, I conclude with this sentence: money, banks, and payments are the key for reform. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay.
No more dollars, even for smart kids. Well, thank you. That's quite something to let go down into our brains and
wait, do we want to hear
process?
If it's not too long, it would be good to hear it, but you all know.
I get the feeling here that you're coming close to, I think, what also Richard Werner more or less proposes, and that is you don't have to go for full monetary reform as long as there is something of a how do you call it, credit guidance, that banks will be guided, or that there is a system in place that the money created will only be for GDP positive activities, and not that, as you indicated, and I was not, and I don't even know the numbers there, how many banks are loaning each other maybe massive amounts of money with which they, you know, inflate their books and make money for themselves. And, you know, the regular public has no idea probably what is going on there. So yeah, so it comes down to a certain credit guidance there. So with my readings of post-Keynesian economics, I'm totally pleased, of course, that the endogenous theory of money, that is in the same way that we understand money creation. And of course, we come to the differences of the prescriptive side, of the normative side. We can all agree on the descriptive side, on the theoretical side, but we might have some differences on the normative side. But those normative differences can be figured out maybe through modeling or through empirical research. And that's where I'm myself interested in, because we know that, for example, Kumhoff and Benes made these papers about how would the system look like if we indeed would implement the Chicago Plan from the 1930s. And they came up with very nice outcome. They were even surprised that it was even better than they expected in the first place. Less up and downs in the economy, less debt in the economy, less volatility, etc. Less inequality. So that was all really, really good. So if in a certain sense we are going to settle some of these issues on empirical grounds, I'm very interested what the post-Keynesians indeed come up with, like how do we settle, or how would, let's say, your proposal, which might be, you know, empirically speaking, maybe the best proposal, and then it's kudos to you that you came up with the best proposal. But how do we assess, you know, what the horses that are in the race will perform, and where will we and how will we, you know, implement it? Do we need another Bretton Woods for the international system? And I'd say, yeah, of course, because that will have to be an international treaty of sorts. In the same way that at the end of World War II, we got to everybody went to Bretton Woods, and Keynes was a great thinker there to come up with. And apparently then, to our chagrin, we did not adopt the Bancor. But anyway, so I want to go back then on that empirical way. How do we establish this in a scientific way? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. It's really a series of challenging questions. I think, first of all, let me point out that, at least as regards Switzerland, in 3 working days, banks pay themselves the whole amount of Swiss GDP for a year. So the interbank market in 3 working days has a volume of transactions that correspond to the full year Swiss GDP. So you see that I would say 98% of the transactions in Switzerland in a full year do refer to interbank market transactions, just a tiny part of which are linked to GDP. So we have to make sure that the banking sector again becomes instrumental for firms to produce output, and firms have to pay out correct wages in order for wage earners to buy produced output and to have perhaps a full employment situation or close to it. Then I think post-Keynesians have much emphasized and explained and struggled about the endogenous nature of money. But in my view, to the best of my knowledge, as I said, they are now captured by this fashion that we don't need to have major theoretical approaches or models. We need to have an empirical based analysis or a model based analysis. And what I noticed since a number of years now is that post-Keynesians in general refer to so-called agent-based modeling. it is a micro-founded approach, which is not the mainstream one, but still it goes in the same direction on methodological grounds. Namely, they try to explain how the whole economic system works, looking at the individuals. And I always make a comparison again with medicine. If we study medicine, we don't begin at the first year at the patient level studying the individual cells of the human body. We study the whole body, how it works, how the interaction between the heart, the lungs, and so forth. And the same should occur for studying economics. We should not begin studying microeconomics and then aggregating this magnitude as if we then have a macroeconomic magnitude. No, we should understand how the whole economic system works first, to then investigate some parts of it. And in this view, I think post-Keynesians have lost Keynes' original message. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. And here I refer to Samuelson's fallacy of composition, fallacy of composition, sorry. Fallacy of composition means that what is right for the single might be wrong for the whole set of agents, and the opposite. I think that, we need certainly to think or rethink all these issues, and the Chicago plan might be useful in this regard. I think we should get rid of the fractional reserve banking, but not moving entirely to the full reserve banking. We should find a go-between, halfway station. And I think that Bernard Schmidt and the quantum macroeconomics school to which I belong provide such a halfway station, as I tried to explain in my talk earlier on, to let banks provide credit lines for GDP-based transactions, but to avoid that those credit lines from scratch are provided for non-GDP transactions. And here I think we also need a kind of new Bretton Woods conference at the international level, because it is in the interest of the United States, as I tried to explain earlier on, to get rid of this international monetary disorder, even though over the short run, the US might benefit from it because it might import without exporting. It might buy without paying the trade deficits. But as I said, eventually this goes against the US interest because it inflates the volume of bank deposits in the US, which induces banks to inflate the volume of lending. And eventually this might create financial crisis in the US. And then at the global level, because the US is crucial, it is a major player. So I think, it should come from politicians, but it should also come from financial institutions to gather and to think of a new Bretton Woods conference where international monetary disorder is fixed for good, because otherwise we are going to move from one crisis to the other. If you look at the 15, 20, 30 last years, we have noticed a number of crises, and the last subprime and so crisis was even a systemic crisis. So the world is showing us we need to reform at the national and international level the monetary system, and we just cannot fix the behavioral issue. We have to go a layer lower and fix the structural, institutional disorders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ronnie Phillips needs to leave soon, and I just want to ask Ronnie if he has a question.
Yes, Professor Rossi, I enjoyed your talk very much. I especially like that quote from David Ricardo. You know, I use that on page 1 of my book from the Chicago plan, and that's really important. It's fundamental. Secondly, your proposal also, as far as reform nationally, sounds very much like the 2-window proposal that was put forward by Fred Carnes at the FDIC back in about 1988, 89, when we had the problems in the United States. So again, I think that's very good. And lastly, of course, the International Central Bank, I mean, that would be very interesting. given the politics, the stuff today, that's where the real problem could be. I know that they've talked about trying to evolve the Bank for International Settlements into doing that, but that doesn't. I think the BIS would like that, but that hasn't really happened so far. But anyway, I don't have any really disagreements with your proposal whatsoever. I think it's very interesting.
Thank you very much. It's really encouraging to hear this from you. I have to investigate better the two windows proposal because I'm not aware of it, but I'm going to look at this literature. And I think that the international level, we have this forum where central bankers gather, the Bank for International Settlements, but it is not actually a bank. It is an institution. And I think we should try to move in the direction already at the European level. A number of countries have been suffering from the single currency, from the fact that it is the European Central Bank in Frankfurt deciding the policy rates of interest for the whole euro area member countries. And I think that instead of going back to the national currencies, we should transform the euro from a single currency into a common currency, much as the bank or Keynes proposal was. And this could also occur across the world, say in Americas, in the north or southern part of it, or elsewhere, to have a series of common currencies at the international level for different regions, and eventually perhaps a common currency of all these common currencies. But I think that at Bretton Woods 2.0 conference should gather not all countries in the global economy, but the most important ones, the United States, China, perhaps Russia, in light of what occurs in Ukraine now, and also European countries or the European Union as such. And once these major players have been hopefully finding a solution to have an international settlement institution, the name of the international currency unit doesn't matter on economic grounds, it might matter on political grounds, but nevertheless, once all these major players have gathered and found a solution, then this solution might apply to other countries, including the International Monetary Fund. You remember once upon a time when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created, there was this saying that the IMF is a bank and the World Bank is a fund. So we should think upon these two institutions and perhaps making sure that the International Monetary Fund provides these settlement balances that countries need to pay themselves finally, but not with a special drawing right mechanism, because the special drawing right is just the name of a basket of national currencies, as it was the official ECU before the euro became a reality. We don't need a name for a basket of currencies. We need an international currency unit properly defined.
Okay.
Let's go to questions. We'll keep it very informal. So I see a hand going up. Okay, Stephen, go ahead.
No, Ronnie, do you have any more questions? I know you got to go soon, or any more thoughts?
No, that's all the comments I had, but thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie, and thank you, Sergio, for your explanations after. They're enlightening. Let me just follow up with one little quick question there, because we don't have Franz here, and I've got we have a Dutchman who would have a question. He's trying to come up with, I'll even bring out his book. This is from Hobart's library, but I have one too. The Tierra Solution. And in this book, he's looking at, he has the idea that maybe the people of the world could push the United States and China to come together so they're not so in such conflict, and that maybe they could have that a UN People's Bank. And in that People's Bank too, it would be oriented towards fighting climate change. You know, there might be a carbon type of currency of some sort. And what I hear you saying is you're very concerned about the payment system and keeping that very clean. This is an additional problem. Is there a way for us to look at international banking and climate change and put those two together?
Thanks for the question, Stephen. This is also a crucial issue. I think that we have to move the financial system, but also non-financial institutions should move into a climate transition, which makes sure that the world is going to still to be a place where everybody can live properly. But I think that central banks should, at the national level, should introduce this issue into their own policy decision mechanism. Also because the interest rate policy, we have been using a negative interest rate policy. Now we are trying to move into the positive domain, the interest rate magnitude, but interest rate policy has an impact on firms' decisions and thereby on climate. And financial institutions also might be influenced by this interest rate policy the central bank puts into practice. And this also should make sure that financial institutions, the major player in particular, go in favor of greening the economic system and not continue with a greenwashing attitude, which in fact doesn't change really what occurs. As regards the central bank, I think that we should also change the people within the central bank community, because nowadays there is this phenomenon, what we call the revolving doors. Perhaps I've been working in the financial sector, and before I retire, I decide to go in the central banking community, or vice versa. I've been the head of the central bank in my country, and later on, I'm going to be the CEO of a big bank. So this is the phenomenon of the revolving doors, and we might also include in the central bank community people from civil society, so that their own interests are also taken into account by the central bankers in their own policy decisions, what nowadays is not yet the fact. So the central bank should act for the common good and not just for the interest of the financial community. Nowadays, we have this mantra, monetarists have been arguing and have been succeeding in making sure that central banks become independent of governments. They cannot finance government deficits anymore. Government deficits should be financed across the financial markets. Well, we should make sure central banks become independent first and foremost of the banking community. We have seen this in Switzerland. If there is a major bank close to bankruptcy, the central bank should bail it out. The government should intervene to support this. So banks have been capturing the central bankers, and the central bank policy is in the interest of banks, but not in the interest of the people in general. And also, it is not in the interest of climate protection. So I think that your point is seminal. We have to make sure that all players, banks, but also central banks, go in the same direction to have a green policy, to have a green or climate-friendly strategy, and not the opposite, which is also what occurs nowadays when the central banks decide about the interest rate policy.
Mm-hmm. I hear that too. I'm going to save further up questions on that. Maybe there's others. I know Nick had his hand up. Maybe Hobart has someone in mind. I think you've got to unmute.
Yeah, Nick, if you're there, go ahead. Otherwise,
Can you hear me?
Yes, Nick.
yes.
You can hear me. Okay, I'm not. I'm having problems with my microphone. What I wanted to get at was that Dr. Rossi, you started talking about the nature of money, but the discussion of the nature of money was basically the economist explaining our money system now, not the true nature of money. And I would say that money is the thing that it's the most necessary thing for existence in civilization. If you don't have money, you can't survive in modern society. It's as simple as that. It's a power like no other power. And the banks have a monopoly on this power now. They have a monopoly on this power that the people don't even know about. People are completely unaware of this. And I don't think that democratic governance is possible in that sort of a situation where the one most necessary thing, how are we going to solve the climate crisis? And nobody in the society, almost, there are a handful of us here, understands where the money comes from. I believe that it belongs with the state to create the money, and not within trying to come up with some sort of a system within the banking system where we can patch it up and maybe it'll work forward. So maybe if you could kind of look at going back for definitions on what money is and the structural history, because until the last few centuries or whatever it wasn't created by the banking system. It was created by the states. The Roman Empire, Bank of England, even only the Bank of before the Bank of England.
Among kings and queens and Caesars.
Yeah, the Holy Roman Empire. That was the emperor was the one that created the money, and then as that began to fall apart, then and these other countries came out of that empire, then it still resided with the sovereign monarch.
Okay, I think Professor Rossi has the. Do you have a response, Professor Rossi?
Yes, thank you for this comment. I'm going to be quite short because I'm running out of time, unfortunately, but I think that we have to separate the state or the treasury from the central bank, as these two institutions have different goals or different objectives. I think nevertheless that the state as the treasury and the central bank should collaborate, should have a cooperative attitude. I remember Peter Cannon saying that in a given monetary union, this monetary union is working properly only when the state and the central bank are at the same institutional level, which is not what occurs nowadays within the euro area. We have a single central bank deciding the policy rates of interest, the European Central Bank, but we have different states with their own fiscal policies, even though those are constrained. I think that the state has to decide about fiscal expenditure, so the fiscal policy, and the central bank should decide about monetary policy, but also supporting government spending. Because the state, usually in a sovereign country, the state has always the power to collect taxes to repay the debt it has been accumulating when the economic system was in a difficult situation, which is not the case nowadays, for instance, in Italy or in Greece. So money is power, as you correctly pointed out, but I don't think that the state money approach would per se be better than the current banking system where we have two tiers, the central bank issuing central bank money and commercial banks issuing commercial money or commercial bank money or private money. I think that, for instance, the central bank digital currency issue might provide also a solution in order for individuals to keep deposits with the central bank instead of keeping them with commercial banks, so that commercial banks might also be more attentive in not inflating the money supply by the credit lines they grant for non-GDP based transactions, because depositors might leave them to deposit their savings with the central bank, issuing a central bank digital currency, a retail CBDC in this case. So I think the state as a public sector objectives, namely full employment, climate protection, a given income and wealth distribution that increase social cohesion instead of doing the opposite. And the central bank should support these public sector objectives with its own monetary policy decisions, allowing the central bank to buy government bonds on the primary market where those bonds are issued, and not just on the secondary market when banks want to get rid of those bonds in case of a financial crisis.
That was clear, and I understand your points on guidance. And also, there may be some differences, but we have a lot to think through here. Do you have time for one more question?
Yes, yes.
Joe.
Thanks so much for your great presentation. I loved your comment about the independence of banks. That's really thinking outside the box. That was a great comment. My quick question to you is, and you sort of referred to it just now, Professor Huber has proposed that a halfway point would be to have central banks purchase government debt as consols or perpetual bonds. Would that fit in with what you just described about direct purchasing by central banks?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question and also for your appreciation. As regards Joseph Huber's proposal, I agree. Central banks are not commercial banks. Namely, commercial banks have been trying to get higher and higher profits over time, to pay out higher dividends to their shareholders, to pay out huge bonuses to the CEO of these banks. So the issue for a central bank is different. The central bank might lend to governments at a lower rate of interest and even over any long-term maturity. And if there is a government debt close to maturity, the central bank might refinance it without any problems, and also without the need to increase the interest rate, even though so-called rating agencies have been downgrading the government debt, actually. So again, I think it is a purely ideological view to avoid that the central bank might finance government deficits. It is a pure ideological view because it goes in the interest of the wealthy people, but it goes against the common good, against the general interest of the whole country. And we see it in the euro area. A number of countries have been suffering tremendously from austerity policies, and also because the country's government cannot be financed by the national central bank, not even by the European Central Bank, apart some exceptions like the Greek case, when the ECB allowed Greek banks to accept Greek government bonds in exchange for liquidity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Closing thoughts, Hobart, or comments? You're muted.
Yeah, I have a little background noises in the hostel that I'm living now in India here, which is a whole new experience for sure. Going a little bit from where Nick was going, my concern, not concern, is there a way that if there is credit guidance with the banks and there is still a growing economy, if the state can still catch the seigniorage of the increase of the money? So when I got into thinking about, the money supply and its increase, I was trying to make calculations on, let's say, on 2014 numbers in the USA. Like if it grows with 3%, the money supply would grow with 3%, and that would be basically then the seigniorage that the state then can capture, to cover a part of its expenses. I think there is something of a myth, maybe, but maybe you can clear that up, that some people think that if there is full monetary reform, that the state then can fund itself, which I don't think so, because then you would create inflation because they would make so much money and spend it into the economy without draining it back again, that it would be quite a disaster. But is there within your system still a chance for the state to catch seigniorage?
Thanks, Robert, for this question. I've still 5 minutes to go, but I think it's enough to provide some answers from my side. Seigniorage is an old-fashioned idea, namely the seigneur in the Middle Age capturing an income, a real or monetary income from the people working within his own domain. And the idea that the bank or the central bank issuing money captures an interest income is linked to this seigniorage idea. But in fact, banks and even the central bank, if they earn an income issuing money, it is not because of the money issuance, it is because they have been granting credit. If I am a banker and if I provide a credit line to any agent, I'm earning an interest, hopefully, from this credit line I've been granting. But then on the other side of my balance sheet, I have some deposits on which I have to pay out an interest. So the business of the banks, the core business, is to earn an interest that is higher than the interest rate they pay on deposits. And the same for central banks. Central bank money pays no interest in the form of bank notes, might pay an interest in the form of what we used to call reserves, but well, then the bank also obtains an interest from the lending, say to the government, it has been doing. So for banks, as for central banks, the profit originates from their credit lines, from their credit capacity granting, and not from, say, creating something positive out of nothing. So we have to distinguish the legal validity of the currency from the economic purchasing power of it, which comes from production. The state might impose as within the country to use the national currency units as a means of payment, but the purchasing power of these currency units don't depend from a state law. It depends from the fact that there is a production. I always say to my students, you might feel rich if you have 1 billion Swiss francs, but to be rich, in fact, this depends on what about how much you can buy with 1 billion Swiss francs. If you can just buy 1 chocolate bar, you cannot say you are rich. If you might buy houses, jewelry, cars, buildings, and so forth, then you might be rich with 1 billion Swiss francs. But all this output has to be produced. Cars, jewelry, chocolate bars, everything is the result of production. So the purchasing power of money depends on production. And even if the state imposes us to use, say, the Swiss franc in Switzerland, this is a legal law, but it doesn't matter if there is a legal law that there is also purchasing power beyond it. What matters for economic reasons is what has been produced and what can be bought with these money units. And the same for state money. We don't have to conflate the state and the central bank, even though both are institutions of the public sector.
Your presentation, Professor Rossi, is extremely clear, and we're very appreciative. Your answers were extremely clear. It's been very rich, and we've got a lot to think about and digest, and we are in appreciation, and you have a great rest of your day, and thank you for spending this time with us.
Thank you very much, Stephen, Govert, and all other participants. It was really a pleasure for me to be here, even at distance, and hopefully we will meet again at distance or in presence eventually.
Yeah, and Joe mentioned that either he or I would contact Ronnie and send you information on the 2 windows.
Yes, yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Rossi, thank you indeed. It was a pleasure again. Lots to think of. I thank you also for looking through my 2 papers that I hope to share soon with our monetary reform crowd. And if I get too much pushback, I'll contact you again.
Yes, yes.
But yes, thank you so much. Maybe we can stop the recording. But grüß Gott.
Yeah, that was interesting. We ended up talking as a group, and obviously you might be guessing what we talked about, but maybe some people here would have comments or would want to talk first. We should open it up for more people. And if you have thoughts about that, raise your hand and let's hear what you have to say. It's all good. And I'm not sure if I need to be spotlighted. I'm thinking that I'm going to remove it. I'm just going to open it up now. We're at 5:40. As far as I'm concerned, this begins the social hour. but also there might be some natural thinking about this, and we can all see each other. I think that's the best thing right now. So does anybody have comments on Rossi? Remember, he's a central banker. He has a key role. I mean, he's one of the thinkers in Switzerland. You'd almost think they invented the money system, but with everything that goes on and how the country is run there in their monetary thinking. So
Stephen, let me do two observations.
Yeah.
On my last question, I didn't feel I got a real answer about seigniorage. Either I lost what he was saying, or he went off on a tangent. But I didn't get a clarity on the seigniorage. The other thing is that, okay, the two papers that I was talking about, one is the one that I presented this morning. He agreed with my analysis, and actually how I wrote the paper, he thought it was very stimulating, because I got a little bit of get a little in the face of MMT there. And the other paper is a summary of what Rochon already wrote 20 years ago, and I submitted that to the AFJM to be published as an article or as a blog. That's my thing there.
Well, MMT is correct when you can create jobs and you're creating money for jobs. That's perfect. And that was.
Yeah, but that's not what MMT is saying.
I know. It says more than that, but that's where Rossi comes in and gets close to MMT. And he missed on the seigniorage question, but anyhow, and I'm glad you brought it up, and Nick set it up and you hit the home run on that. So I thought you guys did well on that. And let's go to Nick first. I mentioned his name, and then we'll go to Franz. You're muted, Nick.
Okay, I think, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, very good. Okay, as I said in the comments there, that both Stephen, both you and Dover, are perfect gentlemen, and we're lucky to have you. You kind of clean up for the rough edges. I don't know. I find it disappointing when people have an understanding of how the system works, but they don't want to change it. Anyway, I think it's our job to say that, to mention that to them in nice ways or whatever it is, and certainly keep everything above board. But we have to stand up for what we believe in. And anyway, I didn't, because I had seen that thing and I had to go walk my dogs, but I came back, I saw the last 10-15 minutes or whatever, and I got to see my question and his kind of non-answer to my question. So anyway, I'm ready for a cocktail, even though I don't drink anymore.
Go ahead, Franz.
Yeah, I was about to praise him in terms of making the point that structural change is not the same as systemic change. And it was Nick saying just now, that is what we are really after, because not only the structure has to change, but also the system. So, and then I had in mind of asking him two questions, one kind of philosophical question and one technical one. And the philosophical one is about when he talks about disorders, to what extent would he believe that monetary injustice is one of the causes of those disorders? And this is an important question for all of us, because not only conceptually, but also strategically. What I mean with strategically is that we have to have large grassroots support for what we are trying to do. And in order to have that support, the issue of justice, people understand what is justice. And so getting churches, legacy churches, but also those minor churches like the UU, Unitarian Universalist, the Brethren, etc., are important. So I would have liked to have asked him that question to see what.
I did ask him that question, more or less. I formulated in the way of saying, well, what is the research done in the post-Keynesian school on the bad effects of your correct diagnosis, not diagnosis, but analysis of the banking system itself. And he says, with other things, that is a little disappointing how far they got in that analysis. So there might not be that much in post-Keynesian school to make the connection indeed between the banking system and monetary injustice, and then, you know, one step further, social injustice. So I hope that you know, I might find something, because it was basically because of MMT that I got interested further in post-Keynesian school. And I think that they might still have a lot of insights that we can use, but the things that are really useful for us, they might not be there yet. So I hope one day, you know, they might, you know, put their nose into it and do some further research.
Yeah, and so the second part would have been because everybody has been talking about payments system, but if you start really thinking about it, if you are serious about the whole climate emergency, then also the payment system could be a dual payment system. So it would take care not only of financial debits and credits, but also the climate debts and credits. And so that's a whole new area that has to be considered. But I think that's very important question. It's kind of difficult, but you never know how a person like that might have thought about these things. So that's what I was about to say about this. But I also have a very strange kind of thing on my screen, because I had raised my hand for some time, but probably you may not have seen it, Steve, because on my screen, I had still this breakout group on my screen, and the other one didn't come up. So at any rate, but that's a minor thing, of course.
Yeah, I'm sorry if anything went wrong there, technologically speaking.
Yeah.
But about payment systems, I can only just share a little thing here about India. That they set up a payment system such that most citizens could get money directly into their accounts during COVID. So it was not going through other organizations. For most people, it was a direct deposit. But I have to look further into how India is working and how it's connected with the farmers community, and how their banking is you know, probably it's a duplication of the British system or a continuation of the British system. But a lot of people are asking me like, oh, what did you find about the Indian system? I haven't looked into it enough. You know, I got my studies here. So, but down the line with my friends, Probably next year we'll have a nice presentation about how India is functioning financially and monetarily.
You're muted, Stephen.
Your bank is the name of your bank is Indian State Bank, right? Or Indian State Bank of the North or someplace. And it seems like
SBI.
Yeah, is it public?
State Bank of India. I actually don't know. I got my they're a pain in the derriere because they're super bureaucratic.
That's all. Well, okay. Your money is safe then. And okay, well, we'll get a full report next year. We hope to have, when we sent out letters to people in Zerlenga's contact list was quite extensive, and we lost over half between his death and recently, or in the last few years. And but we're still getting contacts. And one gentleman, Jeff, who's not here right now, he's corresponding with us from China, and and he's ready to share insights and thinking on what's going on in China in a detailed way. It was him and Zaid that had that conversation about Hunan, and we have a gentleman in the Philippines who's wrote an 800-page paper that Nick should be jealous of. It's based on Zerlenga's book, and I don't think Nick got to 800 pages. Have you, Nick? So anyhow, just teasing. And but it's, we're making more connections, and we're making more connections in the third world, and that's good. Who knows? We might be, a small group that helps push Spaceship Earth economics with a just money system. And maybe we can have power economics where we can have trades that need to be equal, because if they're not, then that some part of your spaceship is not getting enough supplies. So we'll consider, all the ideas we can. Any other thoughts? It's opened up. Oscar, you presented. How did it go for Mexico? I was busy in this. I was Alonzo wouldn't let me hear what you said. He made me stay in the other room. I blame it all on Alfonso, pardon me. Alfonso.
Yeah, who's Alonso?
Pardon me, Alfonso. I know, don't cry too heavily.
I tried to say something about the dollars in Mexico, the cash dollars, the bills are not the same value that in the United States, and here is necessary to repatriate the dollars, the bills to the United States physically. The Central Bank of Mexico cannot go into the reserves of the Central Bank of Mexico that dollars, even when the Central Bank has the obligation of keeping reserves, but the central banks or the community of central banks are obligated to Mexican Central Bank to not to have bills on dollars, and that bills has to be sent to a bank in the United States. Then the dollar bills now here, where I am here, is cheaper than in the interbankarian, the price, the interbankarian price. What I try to say is that institutions push the liquidity of cash, of bills of the here in Mexico. I said the institutions is over the market.
I'm wondering, could Mexico or whoever holds that money, could they buy useful products and goods from the United States or make other investments in the United States to help them financially or technologically or with progress or the real economy of Mexico?
The dollars in Mexico are very important. They are sent or brought by the migrants, the workers there in the United States, and a lot of dollars is in the national accounts. About $58 billion in this year are going into the Mexican economy, more than oil, more than tourism. It's the first item in the national economy.
Interesting, very interesting. That may be another paper for you, or what are the deep effects of that?
I'll send you something that I wrote about.
Okay, and maybe AFJM, or maybe AMI, we could have some type of coffee house or. And the other thing we really need to work on, Luciano and Oscar and Manuel is no longer with us, but is really increasing the number. We got to get more people into democratizar el dinero and efforts. So we should be thinking about that. Oh yeah, there's social media, Fernanda. Come on, dear, let's go. So, but anyhow, whatever we can do to support that too, and that would be wonderful. I did a little movie. I was going to show it. I was worried about some no-shows today, and I have a movie of my. I was teaching in a Hispanic neighborhood in Chicago, and we have a movie where Ben Franklin gets hit by electricity and then shoots him into the future. So he wakes up 2014 in my neighborhood of where I'm teaching, which is Mexican American, and they meet my kids. So I've got, Miguel, Friendly, different names, and then Franklin, who's one of my students too, they have a long interaction between what he knows from the 17th century to be smart thinking versus what the kids are telling him what's happened in the meantime. And it's a 25-minute dialogue, and it'd be interesting, but I'm trying to think of other ways to catch students and catch young people to be learning about this. Go ahead, Nick.
Did I correctly hear Oscar to say $56 billion?
No, it was 58 billion, I thought.
Okay, well, 58 billion. Anyway, so many $1 billion went to Mexico, and they're keeping them there. Is that correct?
51 in 2021 and 58 in 2022. $58 billion.
Okay, and that's staying in Mexico.
Yes.
Okay, so that should help our inflation here. People think we have too much money here, right?
Perhaps.
Let's use that as an argument.
The inflation in Mexico is lesser than in France or in the United States by this
and
month.
We got over $100 billion of our money, which is very good. That's a good argument for the fact that too much money is not necessarily going to cause inflation.
Oh, you have the product of the work of the jobs that people from Mexico, from other countries are living there in the territory of the United States and the economy.
That's right, Oscar. And us here, we're not proud of the fact that we don't have a power economics and parity, a healthy parity system of good trades, so that we should be importing more Mexican goods too,
Eh, well,
besides labor. But I mean, the money flow,
eh,
there should be more
I-
jobs in Mexico too.
I don't know very well the economy and the trade between US and Mexico. It's about half $1 trillion. Yes, $500 billion from one to other. The sum of the trade is very, very big.
If-
Well, it's an absolute shame, and I mean, it's, I don't know if you call it a political problem or whatever. We've got 30 or 35% of our people here who just think that anybody from Mexico, there's something wrong with them, and we want to put a wall up there to separate the two, and it's just absolute lunacy on our part. And even the ones that object to it don't want to stake their whole political career on that one thing. You know, I mean, it's horrible, and this is a flaw in our democracy right now, that we can't seem to solve our problems here. So I in no way am casting any aspersions on the people in Mexico.
Well, my thinking is, if we solve the money problem, we'll solve a lot of that, a lot of the problems of immigration and making things healthy in,
Amen.
wherever we are. Go ahead, Lucille.
Yeah, I just, Fernanda answered my one question in the chat, which was just wondering if all that money, US dollars being held in Mexico, is sitting at the central bank or circulating as being used as currency there. Fernanda said it's sitting in the bank. But why I raised my hand then, so you could answer which it is for sure, Oscar, but I have a friend whose son just bought a house in Mexico. He's a filmmaker, he lives sort of as a nomad, and he could afford a house there and he couldn't in the US, but he had to pay 100% money for the house, no mortgage. And so if that's a practice, that's where a huge amount of money is coming from in Mexico.
I have an apartment. I pay cash, not cash, but all the price of the apartment. I paid, but I lived 30 years without a house. I push my money and then I paid, but after I lived renting houses. I don't know if I'm giving an answer.
Yeah. So you're saying for you, you've never been able to afford a house. And for
it's a kind of my mind. I don't like to have a mortgage or debts. I prefer an economic way of life.
Right. But my point was just thinking, well, some of that billions, if it's necessary for Americans who decide they want to live in Mexico or are working there and spending and buying a home, they have to pay 100% of the asking price as opposed to having a mortgage, and that would bring in a lot of dollars. Or maybe that's wrong. Maybe
certainly the people is migrant don't have credits, don't have they rises the house and they are constructing the house in their towns or in the country slowly, and perhaps it's not a good house, but they don't have a mortgage or debts, or perhaps they have debts, but a local debt with another people. The bank, the people is not bancarized. They here disembancarizados, the people with account. Many people don't have accounts.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Don't know if I'm answering you.
Yeah, no, I think I
Well,
understand.
it's a catch system, and people often, if they're building out in a campesino out in the country, they often build a slab of cement and start building the house piece by piece as they can afford it.
Yes.
Now, I
Yes,
have
this is an equalizer. is going same level in the social situation of in Mexico. That cash or that dollars coming from the United States, because they go into the economy, but the popular economy. But the banks are trying to push every dollar to the electronic, the accounts in banks are not they are not they don't like the cash going in the country.
Mhm. Mhm. Very good. Thank you for sharing all that, Oscar.
Thank you.
Luciano, you seem to be happy. What's going on for you?
No. I need to go out and breathe air because I'm like, I get like too many hours. But it was great, honestly, Steven. I congrats to you and everybody. Okay.
Well, everyone,
It was really great.
It's all of us working as a team, so we can look at ourselves. So thank you for all that. So does anyone else want to talk? We have quite a few people.
I'd like to say something, if I may, Steve. Boy, this has been a full day, and all of us are kind of exhausted here from all of it, as Luciano just said. But I want to just add something in terms of what's rolling around in my mind about this whole thing. And that is, there's been a general agreement here that new money should go into the production of goods and services, particularly into addressing environmental decay. And new money should not go into speculative things in the financial sector. And that could be done by several different ways. It could be done through, well, as Sergio Rossi would have a sort of almost credit guidance and have it done by banks. Or under monetary reform, it could be done by government, which would be spending the money in that way if government comes through, as we would hope it would. But either one of these approaches embraces growth. And growth itself is, of course, an environmental challenge. And technology may help with increased efficiency and better use of renewables and so on. But in the past, sort of the historical record is technology has helped us utilize resources faster and produce pollution faster. So whether or not it's really an answer to the problem is an open question. So I think we may never get to a zero growth system because there's always possibilities of growth in some areas and decreasing growth in other areas. But we clearly have to approach a zero growth system. And, you know, the rate of growth is already decreasing and so on. And the current monetary system obviously depends on growth and becomes unstable without it. And in a zero growth system, the money supply would have to be constant. The money supply you don't want the money supply to be growing if the economic activity is not growing. So under monetary reform, the rate at which, if you imagine, you know, theoretically approaching this zero growth system, in a zero growth system, under monetary reform, money would be created by government, but in order to keep the money supply constant, it would have to be, you know, uncreated, removed from circulation by government. In a zero growth system, in a monetary reform system with the government creating money, it would have to essentially create money and take it back at the same rate in order to keep the money supply constant. So, and government, of course, does that by taxation. And so that would be a quote, balanced budget system that you'd have to have with money creation by government and in a zero growth system. So anyway, discussions today kind of suggest that monetary proposals must deal both with the creation of money and with its removal from circulation. A number of people have mentioned this. Christine Desan mentioned this. So that leads me to think that maybe monetary reform proposals are simply incomplete if they aren't coupled also with tax proposals in order to be realistic. So I just wonder whether the monetary reform community that we're a part of has yet really to confront the problem of approaching a zero growth economy any more than anybody else has. And so I just throw up this question because it lurks in my mind as to how monetary reform interacts with these ideas that we have to slow growth and approach this kind of a zero growth economy. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because I've been thinking about it as I've listened to all these presentations. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. No, it's wonderful stuff. I think Edgar and I think Zaid were speaking around the edges of what you're bringing up too. And does anybody else want to talk to that directly? Okay, Bruce first, and then Janice.
Well, I'm going to tomorrow bring up. This is not an answer to your question, John, but it's directed at it in the sense that I'm going to at least bring up. I won't have time to talk about her much, but Kate Rayworth's book on donut economics, she's in Oxford. Okay, you know who she is.
Oh yeah.
You know, the point of that book is to not only reform money, but to start economics all over again, to create a new starting point for thinking about the whole business, the whole economy. And the starting point has to be, she doesn't put it in terms of no growth, but she's precisely putting it, as you know, then the context of the climate issue and the growth issue.
Limits.
In fact, the planetary issue. So it's a starting point from the larger perspective of economics, and it would force monetary reform. And one of the arguments that are the suggestions I'm making tomorrow is that we could follow that lead in terms of widening the context in which we are thinking about monetary reform. And this is what I'm going to say tomorrow is a response to Bruce Roger Vaughan's very, very, for me, very powerful and strong challenge to those kinds of approaches. I just wanted to say that much.
Okay.
Good to hearing you.
Okay, Janice, do you want to make a comment then too?
Yes, thank you. Is it me? I have the floor?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, you
thank you.
do.
So I'm thinking about that in Texas, and I'm thinking about local economics and local agriculture and village development, which Texas is rife for. Well, is rife the right word? Ready for? Cup runneth over for, because the farmers that I'm talking to politically would like to go into family farming. The National Infrastructure Bank could help them do that. And there's a film on Netflix called Kiss the Ground that talks about regenerative agriculture as being a huge solution to global warming. It's when the ground, which all of our ground has been tilled and it's just sitting there naked, just sick, disgusting. I drive through a lot of Texas and see it. If that ground were covered in indigenous grasses, and even grazing animals is okay under this system, you suck back a huge amount of carbon dioxide into the ground. In this movie, the French prime minister at the Paris meeting suggested that for the world, and you know, the major countries, we in Japan, we in China, you know, we're not respectful of this plan. But today, I think it could be reconsidered, and local economic can be huge. So I wanted to just throw that in.
You spoke my mind, Janice, too, in a lot of ways there. We can go small and organic in lots of good ways. Young Kim, did you want to speak up? You haven't spoken for a while. What thoughts, what's going on for you?
Okay, thank you. Recently, I wrote an article in Korean, newly founded organization named Solidarity for Monetary Democracy. And one chapter of that is titled the Currency Citizenship. If you buy or get receive the US dollar, whatever your nationality is, you are a US dollar citizen. If you are Mexican and you hold US dollar, you are a US dollar citizen. That kind of the currency citizenship and currency sovereignty. That kind of idea we need to establish, I think, that it also important that if US dollar sovereignty should be democratic, it should be inclusive. If anybody in the world have a US dollar, the US government and the US authority or US the monetary authority should respect him or her as a dollar citizen. So the IMF lends loan money to a specific country like Greece or the Zimbabwe. The interest rate is different. There is too much big difference between the strong country, developed country, and the underdeveloped country. It all is that because of risk. But we need to think about the inclusiveness. We need to, yeah, if you dollar sovereignty wants to be real hegemony currency, it should include everyone in the planet as no, they should not discriminate so much, yeah, different.
Yeah.
Yeah, currently the Mexican sovereign debt, the interest rate is 10%. Switzerland about 1 or 2%. UK 4%. Everywhere it's increasing. The sovereign bonds interest rate should be controlled by the whole international community. There should be not that much difference. My idea is sovereign rate, the bond rate should be around 2%. 2% is the common goal of the price change. Inflation, target inflation is 2%. Every central bank sets the target inflation control. Yeah, inflation should be managed around 2%. That's the price of money. Yeah, sovereign money or bond rate, the coupon rate should be around 2%, no more. It's the also the sovereign bond should not be allowed to trade it below the face value because it has the coupon. Yeah? Coupon rate should be managed around 2%. I think we, as international citizens, come to an agreement. Let's be inclusive of all each other. And don't do that such big discrimination against countries.
Yes, I'm just learning on how to be a good thinker about that, so I can make progress in that area. I've been upset at my own monetary system in this country, and then I've learned about the Western world, and I have a lot more to put it together internationally. So I have my work cut out for me, and I think we have to restart the system, and I'm looking at farmers around the world. I think slavery has had civilizations have been built on slavery, and today we're often building upon the backs of all the farmers, the campesinos, the people in the country. And we need to do more for them. There has to be a fair economy where people are getting the resources they need. And in terms of interest rate, I liked a lot of what Zaid said on Friday night, and I'm thinking in that direction myself, is maybe to have less interest rates and have less bonds and less financial monkey business, and just straight out more towards money and moving goods to where they need to be, and how to express that in a model better. We have some modeling in the US for how we got through World War II and after for about 10 years. It was called a period of parity, but we wanted an equal exchange rate. I'll give you an example of that. If I buy an avocado from California, I may pay 75 cents for it, say, for example. If I get the avocado from Mexico, I may only pay 50 cents. So my grocery store brings it to me in Chicago and they charge me $1. And they can keep 25 cents extra profit then. But in power economics, I would like to see a system where that 25 cents goes to Mexico. And in countries that have less in that way, those countries then can buy goods from this country that they need from them. It's another way of creating trades that are of equal value, and it brings up everybody together that way. So I'm trying to think of equality a lot more so. I'll be quiet, and we have John wanting to speak now, but thank you, Young Kim.
Thank you.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, hello.
Hello, we hear you.
Yeah. So my net is a bit slow, internet, so that's why I've switched off the video. So I'm kindly sorry for that. I would like to add what Young Kim and Stephen you have said. I think I'll speak with an example. I think in the recent times, I think everybody knows that in our neighborhood, the India's neighborhood, there is a country known as Sri Lanka which got bankrupt. So there was a lot of problems and all. So what I feel is like, to add on to it, I think countries should help each other in formulating the monetary and fiscal policy also. And most of the time I have seen in our neighborhood, like in the neighborhood of India, Bangladesh is also gone in a very bad state now. Obviously, it is not in such a worse state like Sri Lanka, but Bangladesh is also in a bad situation, and the same goes to Pakistan. Even though politically Pakistan is kind of an enemy of India. But I have seen, like, how will I say, like I have noticed this entire thing for a long time and all. The main problem is the fiscal policy, because what I've seen is like the fiscal policies are made just to, how will I say, please the people. For example, in Sri Lanka, a lot of freebies were given by taking debt. So people were getting used to getting those freebies and all, and they didn't understood like that, how will I say, that how are we going to pay this money? So it's more of a, like, my point of view is like whatever you people said, like young Kim said also that there should be some sort of a, how will I say, we should try to collaborate and all. But what I think is like government should collaborate with each other so that they can help each other form the fiscal policy. That is my opinion. So it may help in developing a better monetary policy. So that's my point of view.
I'd like to point out, just to comment on that, John, I think it's in India. I think it's in your national constitution that if there would be a better world government, India might be willing to join that government too.
Actually, Stephen, I'll tell you, the India's philosophy is like this. India doesn't joins anyone. India neither accepts, neither rejects everyone. But India simply says like, you do your own, but don't disturb me, and I will also not disturb you. So I think that is where the political situation in the recent Ukraine-Russia war has come, where like the Indian people, Indian government has said like, we will buy oil because we don't have oil and we simply have to feed the population. So India is still in that, I think, the non-alignment movement that formed back in the 1950s. I think you remember Gamal Abdul Nasser, then our Prime Minister Nehru and all, they formed this. So India is still in that mindset, but the new government, the BJP government, which has come in under our Prime Minister Modi, it has just gone a bit aggressive. So there's a bit difference, but still India is India, I would say. So India, you won't find doing any drastic changes.
Okay. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And